Greetings, friends. Wantingrisky here, and this is the weekly Russian camera update for the week of September 15th through September 22nd of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian camera updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around, keep being awesome. We're going straight into the Prosny direction, and we should, and this is where a lot of the Russian gains are happening. And yeah, let's talk about them straight away. Now, before I begin, this is going to be the last video I'm doing for the next month or so. The next video will be around October 19th or so, because I'm going to be on vacation. But so this is the last video the last update for a while, for at least a month. But then I'll be back to my weekly scheduled programs. But considering we still have one more week before I do that, so let's get into it. So, in the Prosny direction, the Russians are making a lot of progress. This week, we talked about, there was a lot of progress last week, and this week is no different. This week, the biggest changes are happening in kind of this more southern area. And this week, the Russians have completely captured the town of Berezova, the village of Kalinsky, and the village of Nova Ivanovka. These were, Berezova was the main kind of defense node. As you can see, it's the biggest in this kind of circle of villages that are at the border of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. It kind of was serving as a hub of defense, and Berezova was the center of that. As you can see, if you look down, Berezova is a pretty decent-sized town compared to these other villages, and so capturing was a very big deal for the Russians. The Russians also continued moving and took the village of Kalinsky here, yeah, and so that was a very big gain for the Russians. So my guess is the Russians will probably take a few of these tree lines, maybe near Stopova, probably up to this kind of ravine around this point right here. Probably take everything behind this red line. I don't think there's any Ukrainians in these tree lines. And there's actually not that much defense networks here, especially from attack from the west, because it's mostly trying to dissuade an attack from the south. So the Russians could probably clear these pretty easily. My guess, as I mentioned in previous videos, is that they're going to try to take Aristopol and try to start battling for Velika Milikaevka, and that is my guess. And then also probably continue pushing towards Alesivka, Verbova, and maintain a fort. Try to reach the Pokrovsk Galiapolia highway here, which will cut one of the main supply routes to Galiapolia. But in order to do that, they also, because as they push towards this highway from the north here, then they're going to start being exposed in the south here. And also, they want to get closer to Gallipoli from the southern direction. And so for this reasons, they've been pushing to the south here. One of the biggest gains we talked is that they have completely captured the village of Nova Ivanovka. Now, this place has a ton of defenses. If you look at a defense map, there's a lot of trenches that are like right here, and there's this huge multifaceted trench network to the south of Nova Ivanovka, and we saw video evidence of the Russians taking them. So, very big gain for the Russians this week, not only capturing this village, but taking these trenches. I have no doubt that the Russians will probably, as they push towards Alexivka and Verbova, and start battling for Velika Milikaevka. They just have to improve their positions a little bit in these tree lines to the north here. They probably also take Novogorivka, and then, start putting the squeeze on this Uspenivka defense line. This is one of the main defenses the Ukrainians have to protect Gallipoli from the east here. The Uspenivka defense has a river. It's on the other side of the river. It has a lot of other villages interconnected with each other. So attacking it directly might be a very hard nut. But if the Russians attack from the south and improve their positions in the north, they could definitely put the squeeze on this area and then, take everything here, everything here. And then, from here, they could then just keep pushing it forward, cut the main highway here, and then, start, putting this huge squeeze on Gallipoli like this. So then, that way, this road's already under complete fire control with drones. And so, it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to supply their garrison in Gallipoli. And then the Russians will want to take it, and this will be the main one of the biggest logistics hubs for the Russians in this push towards Pokrovsk. But, yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. But, yeah, lots of gains for the Russians in the Prosny direction. Again, Prosny is this area. Technically, this from kind of Novopalovka towards the most eastern outskirts of Gallipoli. This area, I kind of call it the Prosny direction. Technically, they're going towards Pokrovsk, but I just call it Prosny. Anyway, yeah, they're continuously making gains here. Along with this, they're making a ton of gains here to the south. They took the village of Olesivsky here, taking a ton of these, tree lines all around this area. So a lot of big gains have happened for the Russians in this kind of area here. Now, one thing you could see now is that one of the defenses to Hispanica from the south, the village of Poltavka, is now encircled on two angles here, and it's going to be very, very hard for the, and there's nothing that protects them from the west here. The Ukrainians get sent troops from Hispanica down from the north, but it's going to be, the Russians probably have a very good chance to do some sort of big offensive action to try to take Poltavka and take something like this. Because once they have this would give them a solid southern approach towards Hispanica. And, they have defensive, they have a road here that could supply them. They have Malinovka here and so forth. So I think the Russians are going to be planning on some sort of offensive on Poltavka to start putting the squeeze on this Hispanica defense line here. So lots of good gains for the Russians in the Prosny direction here. A little bit more to the north here, we talked about how they liberated all of South Donetsk. The map has been updated, showing that basically everything behind the Volga River has been secured and taken by the Russians. So, now the Russians, they're probably not right up on the river, but, I think all the Ukrainians have been kicked out of this area finally. Now, one thing of note that even the Ukrainians are admitting is that the Russians are now battling for the village of Ivanovka, one of the main defenses for the Ukrainians on the other side of this river. And according to even pro-Ukrainian mappers, is that they crossed the river around this point and occupied these eastern residential areas in Ivanovka. Now, we'll have to see how that develops. Maybe the Russians get kicked out. Maybe there's some sort of, or maybe they're able to expand their positions here. I've always said that the Russians will try to create another bridgehead on the Volga River. I think, storming Ivanovka and trying to, create something like this would be a very good gain for the Russians. I also see, as I mentioned with Velika Milikayevka, they can make a defense, something like, have another bridgehead here. And then, maybe, and then they'll probably try to link these two by trying to take the village of Garlovka. And, have, if you look, probably the main offensive here will probably involve having some sort of, a bridgehead like this. So Prosny's on a high ground, so I don't think the Russians will continue pushing towards Prosny because that'll be suicidal. I think they need to, develop their offensive by encircling it. But I do think these kind of villages on the river itself, like Velika Mikhailovka, Garlovka, and Ivanovka, are on the chopping block, and Ivanovka is now being stormed. Now maybe the Russians get kicked out, maybe they aren't able to take it, but we need to just. That is, even pro-Ukrainian sources are saying the battle for Ivanovka has started, so we shall see how that develops. And so that's the Prosny direction. And then in the Zaporizhia offensive, more gains are happening in the Stepanhersk region. We talked about how the Russians took the Stepanhersk citadel and entered the most southern residential area in Stepanhersk. Well, this week, the main action has been in this kind of area in these dacha, these like residential area on the western side of Stepanhersk. We had GLK confirmation of the Russians being more in this residential area here. Now, they haven't calculated, my thing is they're probably going to try to take everything in this area just to hold the flank here, but the Ukrainians are still in like kind of these northern areas. So the battle for this area is now ongoing, but we do know that the Russians didn't just stop at this waterway. They crossed it and now have positions, around this kind of area right here. So they have positions here, and now there's battle for this kind of southern, I don't think this is Plavny anymore. I think this is part of the village of Primorsky here, this entire area here, which lies underneath this giant canal here. Now, the Russians don't have to go all the way up there just now. They need to take Stepanhersk first. But if they could take something like this, then they'll be in a very good position to start, putting the squeeze on Stepanhersk. So, the battle for Stepanhersk is still ongoing, and there's more squeezing happening there. So that's kind of the general Prosny Zaporizhia offensive. Now let us go to kind of where, there's a huge, this is where a lot of things are happening, but not a lot of changes actually, because the Ukrainians put all their reinforcements here, the Russians have a lot of their best units here, and so it's kind of this squeeze between the best of both armies in Pokrovsk and Leningrad. So, but because of that, there's not been that much changes because each side is slowly trying to grind each other down. Now, in the Pokrovsk direction, let's talk about Pokrovsk itself. This is in this kind of southern area around, like, the battle for them itself is where the Russians have a lot of gains. The biggest thing is that we had GLK confirmation through the Russians ambushing some Ukrainians that the Russians are actually in this western residential area. So, if you look at the bottom of this, below this rail line, is that this map just says this got taken because we had GLK confirmation of the Russians being here. But, obviously just because there's one geolocation doesn't show that where the Russians could be totally. So according to a lot of map updates, even especially pro-Russian ones, is that this western area is being cleared or has been mostly taken by the Russians. Last time we saw the Russians breaking through into this kind of central part. Now this train station to Pokrovsk and this kind of more southern part of Pokrovsk, the citadel here, it's kind of there's these high-rise buildings in the south central part of Pokrovsk are very good defensive networks that the Ukrainians could use for defense, and that's why the Russians aren't able to break into the central part of Pokrovsk. But this kind of area in the western part, southwestern part of Pokrovsk is mostly residential areas, and so it's probably easy for the Russians to infiltrate and secure the positions here. So we shall see how that develops. But right now it seems like the Russian positions and I mentioned this before, is to reach this rail line here, take something like this, have positions in Pokrovsk, and then what my guess is that, they would try to storm this kind of northwestern not residential area. It's more of like a business district or something. Yeah, some like multi-story buildings here and such. And so this cuts off some major roads that supply Pokrovsk. Because if they could storm and take this area, then the only main highway is through Rudinsky, and that are according to pro-Russian sources, the Russians are right on the outskirts of this town battling for it. So it's very dangerous here. So the only main way they can supply is through these like kind of field roads in this kind of northern part here. So right now they can supply through this highway because it's unblocked. But if they could cut this highway, then and also would cut the road from Grishny, then the only place is kind of this area between Grishny and Rudinsky. But they're just kind of field roads, and especially with the Zaporizhia coming up with all this rain, it's gonna be hard for the Ukrainians to supply their troops here. But anyway, so yeah, the Russians are continuing breaking into Pokrovsk, getting more and more ground here, and then also we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of graveyard right in front of the citadel here. And according to some pro-Russian sources, they have taken a few of these high-rise buildings that are on the western side of this area, maybe giving them a small position here. But obviously, I don't think they're going to try to storm this citadel directly. Maybe they are. Who knows? But again, the citadel can be, reinforced. This entire eastern part, can still supply them. So it's going to be hard not to crack here. So. But it does show that the Russians are right battling for the citadel because they're right on the outskirts of it, all over the place. So we don't know exactly which, if they've occupied some of these, if these are just reconnaissance and forces and they're not actually anywhere here. But it does the maps and some pro-Russian sources are saying they've captured a few of these buildings, like this area here and all that. But the Ukrainians still control the most, like 90% of the citadel area. So. Maybe the Russians just want to have a small foothold here. But yeah, it does show the Russians are at least right on the outskirts here. So battle for Pokrovsk is, they're breaking more and more into it. We actually had also another video of the Russians entering the village of Novoboltovka. We don't know what happened there. We don't know if they secured it, but it does show the Russians were disembarking here, and the Russian sources are saying they're trying to clear Ukrainian positions in this little village right here. We're still going to wait to see if they maybe raise their flags, maybe some more updates, but it does show that, the Russians can't storm Novoboltovka, so we shall see how that, if the Russians could, improve their positions here a little bit more. But we shall see. And then a little bit more to the west here is that the Russians are putting they have completely captured the village of Muravka. We have the Russians raising their flags in this area, raising their flags right on the eastern outskirts of Muravka. And so that's another village that was captured. But again, there's a bunch of other defensive lines here. They have a trench network right on the border of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and I have no doubt that the Russians, as they try, once they took all the villages in the southern part here, that they stopped kind of pushing towards the southern part of Pokrovsk. They took Zelina Kut, Novoukrayinka. Now there's just a bunch of fields up towards Novopolovka, but the Ukrainians have very strong positions in this really big town, and they could then drone any Russians that try to enter through these fields here. So. I think they're not gonna. It's not like now that it's just empty fields towards Novoboltovka. The Russians will be able to break through easily. There's a lot more. It's still hard. But yeah, taking Muravka was a good, decent step here for the Russians here. So we shall see. But I don't think Novoboltovka will be taken until the Russians have this bridgehead, as I mentioned before, in the Prosyana direction. And then a little bit more towards the Minigrad area. We see we had geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians bombing the Russians in the center part of Minigrad in a school, I believe. Let me see if I have a specific. There's like a specific building. I'm trying to find it, but it was somewhere in this group of buildings right here. So the Russians were getting bombed in this area right here, and I forgot which building specifically, but it does show that where the Ukrainians were claiming on raising their flags, it seems the Russians are back in there because the Ukrainians are bombing it. So it does show that I think that the Russian positions, at least here, are much more secure than people might think. So I do think that the Russians are in Novokonomichnia and this gas station and such. Not gas station, but kind of gas factory or substation. I forgot what this type of factory this was, but anyway, I do think that it does sell credence that this is not just some giant gray zone, and that it's more of like, okay, maybe it's not fully, it's like more in Russian control than Ukrainian control. It's not a 50-50 split where each side can enter it willy-nilly. I think the Russians are more in control here, but I do think the Ukrainians could enter it if they wanted to. But it's not like, I think right now most of the time it's under Russian control. So yeah, this kind of gray zone around Novokonomichny and the defenses of the east of Leningrad are more evidence is coming in that it's more under Russian control than Ukrainian control. And then in the kind of this Dobropilia kind of breakthrough pocket that is where the Ukrainians are making gains, we see according there's most of the geolocations this week didn't really prove any of the map updates. The map updates from especially from Ukrainian sources are saying they're breaking in. They've taken more of these fields towards Bolivka. They've taken these fields near Mayak, but we don't have any proof of that. We only have proof that the Russians or the Ukrainians have taken Volodymyrivka. That's true. That's one of the biggest. That's one thing that they said they took that as proven. But in terms of like that the Ukrainians are about to sever this entire area, we don't have a proof of that. Obviously, that doesn't mean it's not happening, but it is true that the Ukrainians are pushing it. This is where the Ukrainians they need to take the village of Nikolaevka and Panovka and Mayak. This is where the Ukrainians are pressing, because if they could take these string of villages, then they'll be able to then cut off this entire pocket to the north here, and then encircle a bunch of Russians here. So that's probably the goal. The goal is to go cut everything. Let me redraw it here. To cut everything above this red line. Once they do that, then they're going to try to break into Novotoretska, and then destroy this entire pocket that's battling for Radinsky. The main goal for the Ukrainians is to kick the Russians fully out of everything behind this red line. That is the main goal for the Russians, for the Ukrainians. Because if they can do that, then they completely break the northern encirclement of Pokrovsk and Leningrad, and then the battle for these cities will be ongoing for much, much longer. So we shall see how that goes. Alrighty, that is the Pokrovsk direction. Now we're going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction. Now, this is kind of the world between Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka, and kind of this area right here, is that most mappers are saying that the Russians continue pushing north here, and are right south of this kind of road. This road that leads between Sofivka and Dovolbalka, kind of like, and the Russians cutting this would cut on the main roads connecting these two, the defenses in the Shakova pocket and the Dovolbalka kind of line of defenses in the western part of Kostyantynivka. And the Russians are like clipping up on the heels of this road here, taking a bunch of these fields here. So it does show that the Ukrainians probably aren't able to push the Russians out on these fields here, but they're probably trying to make some sort of effort from Volodymyrivka and putting the pressure on Russian positions near Popov Yar, kind of more in the south here. If they could continue pushing towards Popov Yar, though, that kind of will threaten the Russian positions that are pushing towards this kind of road here, and then they'll have to break off this kind of retreat back to these line of villages here. So again, the Ukrainians pushing in this direction threatens the Russians' offensive operations in this area. But lots of back and forth here. Now in Kostyantynivka itself, there's been some changes. The main thing is that the battle for Kostyantynivka has begun, technically, because the Russians have entered the most eastern outskirts, these dachas, these dachas that are right here. They have entered these dachas, and they have, according to pro-Russian sources, they've taken them. According to most other mappers, they've entered it and taken some of it, maybe not secured fully of it. But again, so I guess it depends on maybe Kostyantynivka begins in the actual residential area, not the dachas here. It depends on your thing, but we could probably say that the battle of Kostyantynivka has begun with Russians, entering these dachas, these Kostyantynivka eastern dachas, and almost securing them. So I think we could say the battle of Kostyantynivka has begun. The biggest gain for the Russians, they liquidated this kind of pocket that is between the Chasiv Yar area and the this area in the south area, Toretsk. This has happened. We have more geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of pocket. So this area between Alexander Shuchina and Prosyana has been taken. They're very, they really don't want to admit that they lost this kind of forested area. So we shall see how that, unless there's some evidence comes out that Ukrainians got it back. But I don't, we shall see. But anyway, this pocket that was between Prosyana and Alexander Shuchina, this entire area, like kind of like right here, has been liquidated. So that's very good. Now they have a smooth defense on the other side of the canal here between Chasov Yar and Alexander Shuchina, which will give them the forward operating positions to start battling for Kostiantynivka. But I don't think they're going to try to attack it directly. I do think they want to make more encirclement efforts to put the squeeze on the city. Speaking of the other pocket, is that the battle for the Klibin-Balka pocket is still ongoing. The Ukrainians are still holding on to it. They're still in Klibin-Balka. So, I don't know why they're still here. They're losing a lot of forces, but, because they have barely any able to supply here. But they still are. So I don't know why the Russians aren't able to liquidate Klibin-Balka. It's pretty, I don't know why. But, yeah, but this pocket is still under Ukrainian control, and this prevents the Russians from securing themselves in the southern part of Kostyantynivka here. So, yeah, the battle for the pockets is going good in one way for the Russians, but bad in another way. Well, not bad, it's just not as successful as they want. And then, yeah, there's been nothing in this Chasov Yar area. Once they took it, they kind of paused. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Seversk direction, and in the Seversk/Lyman area, this is actually where it's becoming more and more, it's not just like, oh, maybe they're active here and, there's just small gains. This is where a lot of the main action's happening. A lot of people are now saying that Seversk and Lyman might be the places that fall before Pokrovsk. I'm not saying that just yet. Pokrovsk is actually being fought inside and is encircled on a lot of angles. Seversk and Lyman, the Russians are getting closer there, but they're not even in those places yet. And they haven't like finished the encirclement shaping operations yet. So I do think we need to still wait a little bit to see how fast they could get to that point. But anyway, in Seversk, the main thing is we had geolocated, well, not geolocated, but most mappers are saying that this area, so there's a river here, the Bakhmutka River here, and that everything to the other side of this river is kind of this big gray zone, and that, now there's a few fortified areas. There's a fortified area here, there's a fortified area here, and I think here, and these areas form like these mini strongholds where there's a bunch of trenches and strongholds, and, sometimes some mappers are saying the Russians are here, some mappers are saying nobody's here. But anyway, this is where the main battle is going on. We had geolocate confirmation of the Russians raising their flags all over the most like edge part of the Seversk forest, proving that they captured this forest finally. So that's very good for the Russians. And so since they have captured everything up here, they could definitely, now they have positions. The Russians can move from Serebrenka, and start clearing these strongholds here. We actually looking at confirmation of the Russians being in one of these strongholds in the most eastern part of this area right here in the northern part of Seversk. But I think right now this is where the Russians are focusing. But we don't know the extent of how fortified the Russian positions are here. Anyway, but this is where the Russians are focusing, and the main goal here is to take the village of Doronovka and the strongholds, and once they take these areas, then they have encircled Seversk from the north here. In the south here, it's been kind of quiet. The main thing is we still have some geolocated confirmation of the Russians storming a bunch of these areas around Vimfka, just some strongholds here. So just a little push here. We still don't know if the Russians have actually taken Prosyana and Fedorivka. They claim they have, but we still need to wait a little bit to see if they have. So I'm still waiting to see the clarification in the southern Seversk area. But yeah, that's the Seversk direction. And we talked about, now let's talk about the Lyman direction. We talked about the Serebrensk forest. We talked about how the Russians captured it. This week we got 100% confirmation of that, just video evidence. But, again, video evidence happens like, maybe, it doesn't happen the day of they capture. It takes time for them to actually take it and then tell them to secure it, repel any counterattacks, make the video, and then upload it. So it takes a little bit for the, so just because the video was uploaded this week doesn't mean that they didn't clear the forest like a week or two ago, as like I said. Now, the biggest thing, again, is the trying to encircle Lyman, and this is where the Russians are making a lot of good progress. This week, the battle for Yampil is beginning. Yampil is the doorway to the southern part of Lyman. Taking Yampil would not only cut off the highway, allow the Russians to cut the highway between Seversk and Lyman, cutting a major supply network to Seversk, but it would also allow the Russians to, push through these forests towards Zaporizhia or Zania, and then start, cutting off Seversk from the south here. So the main goal would be something like this, capturing everything here, and below on the northern part of the Seversky Donetsk river here. So they could capture this kind and start entering this forest here. They'll be able to enter Lyman from the south here. And, again, with the Russian forces in the north trying to enter Lyman from the north, you can see that they're doing shaping operations to enter Lyman. Again, they're not close yet. There's a few villages that are the gateways. The gateway to Lyman from the south is Yampil. They've started battling for that, but we can't say that, but they have to actually take Yampil first. The battle to enter the northern part of Lyman is for Zaporizhia, and they haven't even entered this town yet, but they have, they're taking a bunch of these towns in the north here. And then, the battle for the eastern part of Lyman is in Zaporizhia and Stavka, and, they're about to finish the battle for Zaporizhia. So they're doing the right moves to start entering closer and closer to Lyman, but they're not actually, they haven't finished them, and they're not in Lyman. So, again, I don't think Lyman's about to fall, soon, but, it's definitely getting closer and closer to that. But yeah, so in terms of Yampil, the Russians have taken these, they've crossed the river here and taken what they call the ostrich farms, and then they use those ostriches to, according to some mappers, take this eastern part of Lyman, this kind of the most eastern part here. And that right now the clashes are going on this railway section right here. So the center part of Lyman is still, of Yampil is still under Ukrainian control, and they're doing a bunch of counterattacks. But right now what the Russians want to do is secure their positions in this kind of forest here, and maybe cut something like this. Cut the railway, take the eastern part of Yampil, and push the Ukrainians to the center part. And then once they have positions there, they could accumulate forces and start pressing the Ukrainians in the center part of Yampil. But I do think the Ukrainians are going to put a lot of forces to try to hold on to Yampil, so because it's very important for the Russians, for the Ukrainians. But along with this, this would cut one of the main roads that supplies Duranovka. So, this would supply the northern part of Seversk. Now, the Ukrainians have this highway that supplies the Seversk from the west, which they need to actually take Yampil to cut. But this kind of road that connects Yampil to the northern part of Seversk is going to be cut if they could secure the eastern Yampil train station. So, we shall see how that develops. The battle for Zaporizhia is still ongoing. We actually haven't had any updates about Zaporizhia this week. We had updates last week, the Russians raising their flags on the northern part and the kind of the south-central part, but no updates. So we don't know exactly if they took it or anything, and the Russian sources aren't saying anything, nor are the Ukrainians, so we don't exactly know. So we're still waiting to see if Zaporizhia falls. Now, in the more northern part of the Lyman direction is where things have finally, after like a month or two of battles, after being encircled, the battle for Zhendel-Kulikovo has been taken. We have the Russians getting bombed in this village in the center part of it, so it does prove that the Russians have taken this village. They have finally taken it. And not only that, we had confirmation of the Russians taking prisoners in the kind of this northern forest belt of Derolovo. Now, we don't know if they actually have taken this, but the Russians are storming this northern area. Derolovo is a very small village. It's a one-way street village, so I have no doubts that the Russians will take this small village, within a few days. But once Derolovo is taken, then that is where a lot of more harder parts come in for the Russians, because then they're finally going to enter Dobrosheva, which is the main the thing that holds Lyman from the north. And as you can see, it's a very big village, very big. And then Novoselivka as well, so if they want to outflank it from the north here, there's another big village in Novoselivka. So there's a bunch of these big villages, towns here that are going to be a very big problem for the Russians. So we shall see how that develops. But yeah, taking Zhendel-Kulikovo was a very good first step for the Russians, and they have, this could be the base of operations as they push southwards. And a little bit towards Sardinia, after they took it, they actually took a bunch of these tree lines that are to the west of Sardinia, which makes sense. They don't want to just take the villages down the river, because then they could be kicked out from any Ukrainian counterattack. They want to expand their positions, take more of these tree lines, and that way that they have some forward operating positions so that it gives the Ukrainians a bump before they could break into it. So just taking a few of these tree lines helps the Russians have a bridge on the other side of the Nitris River. And then, so yeah, there's that. And then in the northern part here, the battle for Rikadup is still going on. We don't know if the Russians have been completely expelled from the most eastern part of Rikadup. And we don't know if and we don't know the situation on the eastern part of Kharkov. I do think the eastern part of Kharkov has been taken. My guess is that the front line probably goes something like this, is my guess. Because if the Russians are in, Probably something like this. I don't think the Russians are here. I think maybe there's like some sabotage and reconnaissance groups that are operating in this area. The thing is, I just don't see how the Ukrainians could be in Rekedup and holding if the Russians are like battling for Andreevka and Novy Mir. So it's just a matter of like, this northern part is still a bit, the Russians are holding here, but it's not as strong as it could be, and I think they really need to send reinforcements here and secure their northern flank before they continue pushing towards Lyman. A lot of these forces in like the Kupyansk and Lyman areas, they see the big goal. They see the big goal of Lyman. They see the big goal of Kupyansk, and they want to go towards it. But in order to take it, you have to take a bunch of these small steps that are like pretty boring. Well, why do I why do I care about Rekedup and these small villages in the Kharkov, Donetsk kind of border? I want to go towards Lyman because that actually gives me glory. But it's like you can't. It's going to be very hard for you to take Lyman if you don't take a bunch of these villages and secure your northern flank here a little bit. We're not saying shift your focus towards just just pushing through here. It's just kind of more. You just have to take a few of these villages to make a more secure northern front. Anyway. But yeah, that's the Lyman direction. Now we're going to go to the Kupyansk direction, and in the Kupyansk direction, there's been some small changes. The biggest thing is the battle for Kupyansk is still ongoing. The Russians are trying to push closer and closer towards the center of Kupyansk, at least on the western side. This week, most of the changes are saying that the Russians are moving kind of along this rail line that kind of breaks into here, this rail line as I colored in red. They have captured a bunch of these residential areas that are here. They captured a bunch of these buildings in the northern residential area, and now they're kind of pushing along these residential areas closer and closer here. We also had geolocate confirmation of the Russians are, I think, in the center city hospital, this area right here, because they were getting bombed. And so it does prove that one of the main defenses the Ukrainians have for the northern part of Kupyansk is these like a bunch of these high-rise building areas right here. And so I think what the Russians are doing, they're pushing towards here, moving towards one of the train stations in this area. They're pushing down along the river here, and they're trying to put the squeeze on this high-rise building area here. Because if the Russians could take something like this, kind of everything let me redraw, everything kind of above this red line, then they have then they'll have a bunch of high-rise positions that they could accumulate forces in, and they can it protects them from drones, and it's going to be very hard to dislodge them. And then they could then start pushing towards the center part of Kupyansk. So we shall see how that. And the main goal for the Russians is to cut this highway, because this is the main highway that supplies all the Ukrainian forces on the other side of this Oskol River here. Now there's a bunch of other crossings, but this one through Kupyansk was like the main artery. So cutting it will be very catastrophic. So yeah, the Russians are slowly moving into Kupyansk, but on a slow fashion. And then here in this kind of area, it's been frozen for a long while, but this week we had more clarification. The Russians have cleared a bunch of these areas to the north of Stepova, Novoselivka, which makes sense. They, looks like the Ukrainians are just kind of slowly falling back towards maybe a foothold in Prosyana, but mostly towards Petropavlovka and these villages that are on the Oskol River. So all these fields between Petropavlovka and everything are probably getting fallen back because the Ukrainians are having a hard time in Kupyansk. So the Russians are exploiting that and taking a few of these positions. And then in the kind of the Kharkov direction, because as we're moving kind of more towards Kharkov instead of Kupyansk, the Russian, we don't have any geolocated confirmation of this, but a lot of mappers are saying this, pro-Russian, even pro-neutral. I think even some pro-Ukrainian sources are saying this, but are saying that the Russians have expanded their bridgehead in the Molova direction, have captured a bunch of these fields to the south of Molova. Before they took Molova and took a bunch of fields in front of it, but now they've expanded in the south, and according to even this mapper, is that the village over Darnia has fallen. This has not been confirmed. We didn't have geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising the flags here, but according to the Syriac, this has been captured. Not saying it's impossible. We just don't have any proof of that. But if it is true, then another good capture of the Russians. It seems like one of the main Russian goals in this position is to try to push the Ukrainians as far back as possible from kind of capture these string of villages here. If they could reach this red line here, they'll reach a river and a bunch of these villages that are on the river. Then they could capture them, have a forward operating defense base, and this would secure the main road that goes from this area from Topilia, Kamyanka, and towards Dorichnia, which is they have an overland route. That way they don't have to cross the Oskol River, which could be which means they have to cross a river. They have an overland route, but right now this route is, they have the route, but it's, the Ukrainians could see it. They're right on their footsteps here, and capturing these string of villages here will push the Ukrainians far away, so they could actually use this overland route without being harassed. So that's probably the goal of the operation there. And then in the Volchansk, kind of part of this Kharkov direction is that we're finally seeing some changes happening in the Volchansk direction. It looks like the Russians are improving their positions in the southern part of the Seversk Donetsk River. The main thing, according to most mappers, is that the Russians have completely captured this factory. This is one of the main defenses of the Ukrainians in the southern part of Volchansk. So the Russians capturing it, is a very big deal for them. Now the main Ukrainian defense is in the southern kind of citadel, the southern bunch of high-rise building areas right here. So this area right here is where the Ukrainians have their main positions. According to a lot, they've been pushing through this forest, capturing more positions here. And according to some pro-Russian sources, that they broke through here, cut the road between Shinlikovo and Volchansk, and are trying to capture a bunch of this residential area behind this red line here, which would be a very big gain for the Russians. So I think what the Russians are doing is just, kind of trying to capture everything in this point right here. And if they could capture this, they would have a very solid position on the other side of the Seversk Donetsk River. And I'm interested to see how they deal with this kind of southern citadel of Volchansk, because the battle for Volchansk has been going on for almost a year and a half now. So it's a very long battle. And I thought they'd stop once they took the northern part, which took forever. But it seems like now the Russians are trying to expand their positions, and taking this factory is a very good first step in having this foothold on the southern part of Volchansk. And there's been no changes in the Sumy direction. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian update. Remember, I won't be back until about October 19th or so. There won't be an update for about a month, but, hopefully we'll see. By that time, the summer campaign will be fully over. I mean, it's kind of already over. Now we're getting to the fall time. But, by that time, the Rapsutitsa will have come, and we shall see how the Russians and Ukrainians deal with the new fall rainy weather conditions by that point. Because at that point when it's going to probably start in full, and the hard ground from the summer is going to start going away. So we shall see how they develop that. Anyway, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoy. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and I hope you have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.